It was a busy Friday afternoon at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The terminal buzzed with travelers rushing to their gates, the sound of rolling luggage and airport announcements filling the air. Among the crowd was Marcus Wilson, a 38-year-old man dressed in a crisp navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants. His appearance was neat and professional, though he had purposely dressed down for the flight. Marcus had spent the last week in Chicago attending an intensive FBI training conference. As a special agent with 10 years of experience, these regular training sessions were part of his job, but they always left him tired. Today, all he wanted was to get home to Atlanta, have dinner with his wife, and sleep in his own bed. Flight 2376 to Atlanta was scheduled to depart at 3:45 p.m. Marcus arrived at the gate with plenty of time to spare. He stood patiently in line as the gate agent called boarding groups. When his group was called, he joined the line of passengers moving through the jet bridge. "Good afternoon," greeted the flight attendant as Marcus stepped onto the plane. He smiled and nodded politely before making his way down the narrow aisle. His seat was 14A, a window seat about halfway down the aircraft. Marcus stored his small carry-on bag in the overhead bin and settled into his seat. He pulled out his phone to send a quick text to his wife. "Boarding now. Should land around 6. Love you." Then he put his phone on airplane mode and tucked it into his pocket. The plane continued to fill with passengers. Marcus watched them file past: business people in suits, families with young children, college students with headphones. A young woman took the aisle seat in his row, smiled briefly at him, and immediately became absorbed in her book. The middle seat in their row remained empty as the boarding process continued. Marcus hoped it might stay that way, giving him a bit more space for the 2-hour flight. But his hopes were dashed when he spotted a woman checking her boarding pass and looking at the row numbers. She was in her mid-50s, with highlighted blonde hair styled in an expensive-looking bob. She wore designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, a cream-colored blouse, and tailored pants. Several gold bracelets jangled on her wrist as she gripped a large leather handbag. The woman stopped at their row and looked at the seat numbers, then at her boarding pass, then at Marcus. Her lips tightened into a thin line. "Excuse me," she said to the young woman in the aisle seat. "I believe I'm in the middle." The young woman stood up to let her in, but instead of taking her seat, the woman remained standing in the aisle. She looked around, seeming frustrated, then caught the eye of a passing flight attendant. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to make several nearby passengers look up. "I need to speak with you about my seating arrangement." The flight attendant, a cheerful woman named Sophia with her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, approached with a professional smile. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "There must be some mistake with my seat assignment," the woman said, lowering her voice but still loud enough for Marcus to hear clearly. "I don't think I should be sitting here." Marcus kept his expression neutral, though he'd experienced this kind of interaction before. He took a deep breath and looked out the window at the airport workers loading luggage onto the plane, deciding to let the situation play out without immediately engaging. Little did the woman know who she was really dealing with, or how quickly her discriminatory behavior would backfire in front of a plane full of witnesses. Sophia, the flight attendant, tilted her head slightly, her professional smile still in place. "What seems to be the problem with your seat, ma'am?" The woman, who would soon become known to the entire plane as Karen, glanced at Marcus and then back at Sophia. She lowered her voice to a stage whisper that was still clearly audible to everyone nearby. "I just don't feel comfortable with my seating arrangement. Surely there must be another seat available." Sophia checked her tablet quickly. "I'm sorry, but our flight is completely full today. Everyone needs to sit in their assigned seats." Karen's face tightened. She leaned in closer to Sophia and said, "Look, I'm a platinum member with this airline. I fly over 50,000 miles a year. I think I deserve to be comfortable on my flight." At this point, several nearby passengers were openly watching the interaction. The young woman in the aisle seat looked uncomfortable, keeping her eyes fixed on her book, but clearly not reading it anymore. Marcus continued to look out the window, his face calm but his jaw slightly tense. He had dealt with this type of situation before. As an FBI agent, he was trained to remain composed under pressure. That didn't make these moments any less frustrating. "Ma'am, I understand you're a valued customer," Sophia replied, her voice still professional but firmer now. "However, all our seats are assigned, and the flight is full. I'm afraid I can't move you to a different seat. Karen's voice rose slightly. Can't you check if there's a seat in first class? I'd be willing to pay the difference. First class is also completely full, Sophia explained. Now, we need to finish boarding. Other passengers are waiting to get to their seats. Karen glanced again at Marcus, who was still looking out the window. Then she leaned even closer to Sophia and whispered, though not quietly enough, I don't feel safe sitting next to him. You understand what I mean, right? A shocked murmur went through the nearby passengers. The young woman in the aisle seat looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Sophia's friendly demeanor cooled noticeably. Ma'am, I don't understand what you mean. Could you please explain your safety concern? Karen shifted uncomfortably, aware that people were staring at her. Well, he looks intimidating. Marcus finally turned from the window, his expression calm but serious. He said nothing, simply waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Sir, Sophia addressed Marcus directly. Are you traveling alone today? Yes, I am, Marcus replied politely. Just heading home after a work conference. Karen interrupted. See, he could be anyone. How do we know who he really is? A middle-aged man seated across the aisle spoke up. Lady, he's just sitting there minding his own business. You're the one causing a scene. Karen's face flushed red. This doesn't concern you, she snapped at the man. By now, the boarding process had slowed considerably. Passengers were backed up in the aisle, trying to get to their seats while the drama unfolded. A second flight attendant, an older man named Greg, approached. Is there a problem here? Before Sophia could explain, Karen turned to Greg with relief. Yes, there is. I've been trying to explain that I'm uncomfortable with my seating arrangement, but she pointed at Sophia, won't help me. Greg looked between Karen, Sophia, and Marcus, quickly assessing the situation. Ma'am, are you refusing to sit in your assigned seat? I'm not refusing, Karen said, her voice rising defensively. I'm simply requesting a reasonable accommodation for my comfort and safety. Greg's expression hardened slightly. Ma'am, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, I need to inform you that this airline has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Karen's mouth opened in shock. Discrimination? I never said anything about. Then please take your assigned seat, Greg interrupted firmly. We need to complete boarding. The confrontation was reaching a turning point, and no one on the plane could have predicted what would happen next. Karen stood in the aisle, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She looked around at the other passengers, clearly hoping to find some support, but was met with disapproving stares and shaking heads. This is ridiculous, she muttered loudly. I'm a loyal customer. I spend thousands of dollars with this airline every year. Greg, the senior flight attendant, remained firm. Ma'am, you have two options. You can take your assigned seat, or you can deplane, and we can rebook you on a later flight. What would you prefer? Karen clutched her designer handbag tighter to her chest. I want to speak to the captain, right now. A collective groan went through the nearby passengers. The boarding process was now completely stalled, with people backed up all the way to the jet bridge. The captain is preparing for takeoff, Greg explained. He's not available to address seating concerns. This isn't just a seating concern, Karen insisted, making air quotes with her fingers. It's a safety issue. At this, Marcus finally turned fully toward the confrontation. His calm demeanor hadn't changed, but there was now a hint of steel in his eyes. Ma'am, he said, his voice steady and controlled, may I ask what exactly makes you feel unsafe about sitting next to me? The directness of his question seemed to catch Karen off guard. She stammered, You never know these days. You never know what? Marcus pressed, his tone still even. Karen struggled to find words that wouldn't explicitly reveal her prejudice. Well, you could be. Anyone. So could you, the young woman in the aisle seat suddenly interjected. So could any of us. More passengers joined in with comments of support for Marcus. This is clearly racial profiling, said an elderly woman a few rows back. Just sit down and leave the man alone, called someone else. Karen's face grew even redder. How dared you? I never said anything about race. You didn't have to, another passenger replied. It's obvious. The situation was growing more tense by the second. Greg made a quick decision and spoke into his handheld radio. "We need a customer service manager at Door 2 Lighters, please." Within minutes, a woman in a navy blue airline uniform with a manager's badge appeared at the door of the aircraft. She made her way down the aisle to where the confrontation was taking place. "Good afternoon," she said briskly. "I'm Sandra Mitchell, customer service manager. What seems to be the problem?" Before either flight attendant could explain, Karen launched into her complaint. "These flight attendants are forcing me to sit somewhere I don't feel safe and are accusing me of discrimination. I'm a platinum member and I expect better treatment than this." Sandra looked at Greg, who gave her a subtle eye roll before explaining the situation professionally. "Ms. Mitchell, this passenger is refusing to sit in her assigned seat next to this gentleman." He gestured toward Marcus and has implied that she feels unsafe sitting next to him without providing any valid reason. Sandra turned to Marcus. "Sir, I apologize for the delay. Have you been involved in any kind of altercation with this passenger?" "No," Marcus replied simply. "This is the first time I've ever seen her. I was just sitting here waiting for takeoff when she arrived and immediately asked to be moved." Sandra nodded and turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, unless you have a specific, legitimate safety concern, I'm afraid I must ask you to either take your assigned seat or I'll need to remove you from this flight." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. "Remove me? I'm the victim here." "Ma'am, if you continue to delay this flight without valid reason, we will have no choice but to remove you and possibly ban you from future flights with our airline." The confrontation had reached a critical point. Passengers were now openly supportive of Marcus, and the tide had clearly turned against Karen. But no one expected what would happen next as the situation reached its breaking point. Karen's face contorted with anger as she realized the airline staff were not going to accommodate her demands. She looked around at the other passengers, many of whom were now openly glaring at her. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. "This is outrageous," she declared, raising her voice so everyone could hear. "I'm going to sue this airline for harassment and poor customer service. I have rights." Sandra, the customer service manager, maintained her professional composure despite Karen's escalating behavior. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. You're disturbing the other passengers." "I will not be silenced." Karen shot back. "I demand to be moved to another seat, or I want this man removed from the plane." She pointed directly at Marcus, who remained calm but was clearly growing tired of the spectacle. A collective murmur of disapproval rippled through the cabin. The flight was now seriously delayed, and patience was wearing thin among everyone on board. "Last chance, ma'am," Sandra said firmly. "Either take your assigned seat now, or I'll have to ask you to deplane, and airport security will escort you to the terminal." Karen seemed to realize she was cornered. With visible reluctance, she finally moved toward the row, but wasn't finished making her point. "Fine, I'll sit here, but I want it noted that I'm doing this under protest," she said loudly. "And I'll be contacting corporate headquarters as soon as we land." The young woman in the aisle seat stood up to let Karen in. As Karen squeezed past her, she deliberately kept her distance from Marcus, pressing herself against the opposite seats. Once seated, Karen immediately pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, presumably composing an angry email or social media post. She kept her body turned away from Marcus as much as the narrow middle seat would allow. Marcus continued to look straight ahead, his face betraying little emotion. The young woman returned to her seat, giving Marcus a sympathetic glance before reopening her book. The boarding process finally resumed, but the atmosphere in the cabin remained uncomfortable. Passengers still entering the plane sensed the tension and looked curiously at row 14 as they passed by. After a few minutes of angry typing, Karen suddenly turned to Marcus. "You know, you could have offered to move. That would have been the gentlemanly thing to do." Several nearby passengers gasped at her audacity. Marcus turned to face her directly for the first time. "Ma'am," he said quietly but firmly, "I paid for this specific seat because I prefer the window. I arrived early, boarded when called, and was sitting here peacefully until you arrived. I have done nothing wrong and have no obligation to accommodate your discomfort, especially when that discomfort appears to be based solely on my appearance." Karen's mouth fell open in shock at his articulate response. Before she could reply, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking. I've been informed of a situation that has delayed our departure. Let me be very clear. This airline does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Every passenger who boards our aircraft deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. A round of applause broke out in the cabin. Karen sank lower in her seat, her face now bright red. We'll be pushing back from the gate shortly, the captain continued. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure. As the flight attendants began their final checks, Karen muttered under her breath, "This is all your fault. You've humiliated me in front of everyone." Marcus turned to her with a steady gaze. "No, ma'am. You did that all by yourself." The young woman in the aisle seat couldn't suppress a small smile at his response. The aircraft finally began to move away from the gate, nearly 20 minutes behind schedule. The incident seemed to be over, but the tension in row 14 was far from resolved. And Karen had no idea that the man she had tried so hard to avoid sitting next to was about to reveal something that would leave her completely speechless. The plane taxied toward the runway, its engines humming steadily. Inside, the mood in row 14 remained tense. Karen sat rigidly in the middle seat, arms crossed tightly across her chest, refusing to make eye contact with either of her rowmates. Marcus had returned to looking out the window, watching the ground crew direct the aircraft. As the safety demonstration began, Karen made a show of ignoring it, instead tapping aggressively on her phone, despite the flight attendant's earlier instruction to put all electronic devices in airplane mode. Sophia, who had dealt with Karen during boarding, noticed this as she walked through the cabin checking seatbelts. She paused beside their row. "Ma'am, we're preparing for takeoff. Please put your phone in airplane mode or turn it off completely," she instructed politely but firmly. Karen barely looked up. "I'm sending an important email to your corporate office. I'll be done in a minute." "I'm sorry, but FAA regulations require all devices to be in airplane mode during takeoff and landing. This is a safety requirement, not a suggestion," Sophia explained, standing her ground. Several passengers watched the interaction, many shaking their heads at Karen's continued defiance. The young woman in the aisle seat looked increasingly uncomfortable to be caught in the middle of this ongoing drama. "Fine," Karen snapped, making a show of putting her phone in airplane mode before dropping it loudly into her purse. "Happy now?" Sophia simply thanked her and continued down the aisle. The safety demonstration concluded, and the plane finally reached the runway. As they waited for clearance to take off, Karen broke the silence in their row. "You know," she said in a voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I travel all the time for business. I'm used to a certain level of service and respect." Marcus didn't respond, still looking out the window. "I have every right to feel comfortable on my flight," Karen continued, clearly trying to justify her earlier behavior to anyone listening. "And when I don't feel comfortable, I speak up. There's nothing wrong with that." An older gentleman seated across the aisle leaned over. "Maybe there's nothing wrong with requesting a different seat, ma'am, but there was definitely something wrong with the way you did it and your reasons for doing so." Karen turned to him, eyes flashing. "Excuse me? This is a private conversation." "Not when you're speaking loudly enough for half the plane to hear," the man replied calmly. Before Karen could respond, the engines roared louder, and the plane began to accelerate down the runway. The sudden forward momentum pushed everyone back in their seats, temporarily halting all conversation. As the plane lifted into the air, climbing steeply, Karen gripped the armrests tightly. Marcus noticed her white knuckles and the way her breathing had quickened. "Are you afraid of flying?" he asked, his tone neutral. Karen seemed surprised by the question. No. Well, takeoffs make me a bit nervous," she admitted reluctantly. Marcus nodded. "Many people feel that way. Statistically speaking, though, air travel is much safer than driving." "I know that," Karen said defensively, but her grip on the armrests didn't loosen. As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Karen seemed to relax slightly. She pulled a magazine from her bag and began flipping through it, still making a point of angling her body away from Marcus. The flight attendants began preparing the beverage service, pushing carts down the narrow aisles. Greg, the senior flight attendant who had dealt with Karen earlier, stopped at their row. "What can I get you folks to drink?" he asked, his tone professional. "White wine?" Karen said immediately. "I think I've earned it after the way I've been treated today." Greg nodded without comment and looked to Marcus, who requested a sparkling water. As Greg poured their drinks, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The aircraft shuddered and dropped suddenly before stabilizing. Karen gasped, instinctively grabbing Marcus's arm in fear. The moment she realized what she'd done, she quickly withdrew her hand as if she'd touched something hot. Her face flushed with embarrassment. "Sorry," she muttered, the first somewhat civil word she'd spoken to him directly. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, but the brief moment of normal human interaction was about to be completely overshadowed by what would happen next. The flight attendants finished their beverage service and the plane reached its cruising altitude. The cabin settled into the rhythmic hum of flight. Karen sipped her white wine, occasionally casting sidelong glances at Marcus, who was reading a book he had pulled from his carry-on bag. About 30 minutes into the flight, Karen's phone chimed. She pulled it out, forgetting it was supposed to be in airplane mode. The sharp sound drew the attention of Sophia, who was passing by their row. "Ma'am, your phone needs to stay in airplane mode for the duration of the flight," Sophia reminded her. "It was just a text message," Karen protested. "It's not going to crash the plane." Marcus looked up from his book. Actually, while the single phone probably won't affect aircraft systems, if everyone ignored the rule, the collective interference could potentially cause problems with certain sensitive navigation equipment. Karen turned to him with narrowed eyes. "Are you some kind of airplane expert now?" "No," Marcus replied calmly, "but I do understand the importance of following safety protocols." Karen rolled her eyes and reluctantly switched her phone back to airplane mode. She then turned to the young woman in the aisle seat. "Can you believe this? They treat us like children." The young woman, who had been quietly reading her book and avoiding the drama, looked uncomfortable. "I think they're just doing their jobs." Karen scoffed and turned back to her magazine, flipping the pages with unnecessary force. The tension in their row was palpable. A few minutes later, a man from a few rows ahead made his way to the bathroom at the rear of the plane. As he passed their row, he stopped suddenly, looking at Marcus with widened eyes. "Agent Wilson?" the man asked. "Is that you?" Marcus looked up, recognition crossing his face. "Director Brooks. Good to see you, sir." Karen's head snapped up at this exchange. The man, dressed in a crisp business suit, smiled. "I didn't expect to run into you on this flight. How was the training conference?" "Very productive," Marcus replied. "We covered some new techniques in digital surveillance that should be quite useful. I'm planning to brief the Atlanta field office on Monday." Director Brooks nodded. "Excellent. The presentation you gave on cross-agency cooperation last month was very well received at headquarters, by the way." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that," Marcus said with a nod. As Director Brooks continued to the bathroom, Karen stared at Marcus with a mixture of confusion and growing unease. The young woman in the aisle seat also looked at Marcus with new interest. "You work for the government?" Karen asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Marcus turned to her with a neutral expression. "Yes, I do." "What department?" she pressed, her earlier hostility momentarily forgotten. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," Marcus replied simply. Karen's face paled. "You're FBI." Marcus nodded. "Special Agent Marcus Wilson, assigned to the Atlanta field office." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a leather wallet, which he opened to reveal his official FBI badge and identification card. The gold badge caught the light from the overhead panel, the words Federal Bureau of Investigation clearly visible above the Department of Justice eagle emblem. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Her eyes were fixed on the badge in Marcus's hand. The young woman in the aisle seat couldn't suppress a small gasp. "Wow, that's really cool," she said. "Wait," Karen finally managed to say, her voice suddenly much quieter than before. "You're actually an FBI agent. Like for real." "For real?" Marcus confirmed, returning his badge to his pocket. Karen's face had lost all its earlier confidence and indignation. She stared straight ahead, her magazine forgotten in her lap, as the full implications of her behavior toward a federal law enforcement officer began to sink in. Several nearby passengers who had overheard the exchange were now watching with undisguised interest. The woman across the aisle gave Marcus a thumbs up behind Karen's back. Karen took a large gulp of her wine, clearly struggling to process this new information that had completely changed the power dynamic in their row. Karen sat frozen in her seat, staring straight ahead. The white wine in her plastic cup trembled slightly in her unsteady hand. The revelation that she had been trying to have an FBI agent removed from the flight had clearly shaken her to the core. Several minutes passed in awkward silence. Marcus had returned to reading his book, seemingly unbothered by the situation. The young woman in the aisle seat kept glancing between them, clearly fascinated by the unexpected turn of events. Finally, Karen cleared her throat. "So, you're really FBI, like catching criminals and things like that?" Marcus looked up from his book. "Yes, that's part of the job." "What kind of criminals do you catch?" Karen asked, her voice now carrying a note of nervous respect that had been entirely absent before. "All kinds," Marcus replied simply. "The FBI handles a wide range of federal crimes." A middle-aged man seated across the aisle leaned forward. "Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing. Are you the agent who worked on that bank robbery case in Atlanta last year? The one with the tunnel?" Marcus smiled slightly. "I was part of the team, yes." "Man, that was incredible work," the man said enthusiastically. "They covered it on all the news channels. Didn't you guys find them by tracking their cell phone signals or something?" Among other investigative techniques, Marcus acknowledged with a professional nod. Other passengers were now openly listening to the conversation. Word had spread through the cabin about the FBI agent in row 14, the same man that Karen had tried to have removed from the flight. Karen sank lower in her seat as she realized that everyone around them now knew exactly what had happened during boarding. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated. Greg, the senior flight attendant, approached their row. "Agent Wilson, I apologize for the disturbance earlier. If there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let us know." "Thank you, but I'm fine," Marcus replied politely. Greg turned to Karen with a decidedly cooler expression. "Ma'am, can I get you anything else?" Karen shook her head quickly, unable to meet his eyes. As Greg walked away, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be starting our descent into Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in about 15 minutes. The local time is 5:40 p.m., and the weather is clear with a temperature of 78 degrees. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Karen finally worked up the courage to speak directly to Marcus again. I think there may have been a misunderstanding earlier," she said quietly. Marcus turned to her with a neutral expression. "What kind of misunderstanding?" "When I asked to be moved, it wasn't because of what you might have thought," Karen stammered. I have a bad back, and sometimes I need an aisle seat for easier movement." The young woman in the aisle seat raised her eyebrows in disbelief but said nothing. "Is that so?" Marcus replied evenly. "Because I distinctly recall you mentioning that you felt unsafe sitting next to me, and when asked to explain, you said you never know these days while looking directly at me." Karen's face flushed red again. "I didn't mean it like that. I'm a nervous flyer." An elderly woman seated behind them spoke up. "We all heard what you said, dear. There's no use trying to pretend otherwise now." Several other passengers nodded in agreement. Karen looked around and realized she was surrounded by witnesses to her behavior. Her eyes began to well with tears of embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, almost inaudibly. Marcus studied her face for a moment. "I appreciate the apology," he said finally. "But I hope this experience helps you reflect on how you treat people in the future, regardless of their profession." Karen nodded quickly, wiping at her eyes. For the remainder of the descent, she sat in complete silence, the reality of her actions and their consequences finally sinking in. As the plane began its final approach to Atlanta, the passengers in the surrounding rows shared knowing looks. This was a flight, and a lesson, that none of them would soon forget. The plane touched down on the runway at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport with a gentle bump. As the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to deplane. The atmosphere in row 14 remained tense. Karen kept her eyes fixed on her lap, avoiding eye contact with everyone around her. Marcus put his book away and checked his phone as soon as the captain gave permission to use electronic devices. The young woman in the aisle seat seemed relieved that their journey was finally coming to an end. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Atlanta," the captain announced over the intercom. "Local time is 6:05 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off." As they approached the gate, Karen finally broke the silence. "I really am sorry," she said quietly to Marcus. "My behavior was inexcusable." Marcus looked at her thoughtfully. "You know, in my line of work, I see the worst of humanity sometimes, but I also believe people can learn and change." Karen nodded, her eyes still downcast. I don't think of myself as—" She struggled to find the words. "Racist," Marcus supplied calmly. Karen winced at the word but nodded. "I've always considered myself a good person." "Good people can still have blind spots and biases," Marcus said. "The question is what you do when they're pointed out to you." The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stood up and began retrieving items from the overhead bins. The usual rush to exit began. As they waited for their turn to leave, Director Brooks passed by their row again. "Wilson, are you heading straight to the office tomorrow or working from home?" "Office," Marcus replied. "I have those training materials to distribute." "Good man," Brooks said with a nod. "See you there." When it was finally their turn to exit, Karen quickly gathered her things, clearly eager to escape the scene of her humiliation. As she stepped into the aisle, she found herself face to face with Sophia and Greg, the flight attendants who had witnessed her earlier behavior. "Have a nice day, ma'am," Greg said professionally, though his expression remained cool. Karen hurried past them and up the jet bridge, disappearing into the terminal ahead of the others. Marcus took his time collecting his carry-on from the overhead bin. As he prepared to leave, several passengers approached him. "Thank you for your service, Agent Wilson," said the elderly woman who had been seated behind him. "Yeah, what she did wasn't right," added a college-aged passenger. "You handled it with real class, man." Marcus thanked them with a modest nod. The young woman who had been sitting in their row smiled at him. "That was quite a flight," she said. "For what it's worth, I think you taught her an important lesson today." As Marcus made his way through the terminal, he spotted Karen standing alone near a window, watching planes take off and land. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded concourse. She gave him a small, uncertain nod before turning away. Outside the secure area, Marcus was greeted by his wife, Aisha, who embraced him warmly. "How was your flight?" she asked. Marcus smiled. "Eventful," he replied. "I'll tell you all about it on the way home." As they walked toward the parking garage, Marcus reflected on the incident. In his 10 years with the FBI, he had faced dangerous criminals, complex investigations, and life-threatening situations. But sometimes the most important work happened in everyday moments like this, challenging prejudice, standing firm with dignity, and perhaps changing one person's perspective in the process. Behind them in the terminal, airline staff were already reviewing the incident report. By the next morning, Karen would receive an email from the airline's corporate office, not in response to her complaint, but informing her of her 6-month suspension from their flights due to discriminatory behavior toward another passenger. The lessons of Flight 2376 would stay with everyone involved for a very long time.